Welcome everybody to the second edition of THEOPHIS, Land of the Dragon Gods and the Cultures that Worship Them. My name is Mel Ve, and tonight we will be dealing with a part of the world that is not particularly on everyone's bucket list, but it should be. Today we're going to visit Ethiopia. Ethiopia is an incredible country and really one that more people should take an interest in because there is so much to know about Ethiopia in terms of the dragonology perspective. So I'm going to jump straight in and deal with the first image that we have here, which is the Ethiopian dragon. Now, this is an image that comes out of what we typically term as a medieval bestiary. Now, the bestiaries in medieval times were used to document all the animals and beasts and mythological or real or otherwise that were known by various people. And often these bestiaries came with a bit of a moral theme to them. There was a bit of a moral story involved in recounting the various traits of these various beasts. But this is typically a picture that you would find in a medieval bestiary. And it's interesting to note from the get-go that of the different types of dragons that you can find in a medieval bestiary, one of the ones you'll normally always find is the Ethiopian dragon. And that's quite interesting that Ethiopia has its own distinctive type and style of dragon. And we'll understand why that is the more we get into this. Central to THEOPHIS was the landmass or continent that we today reference as Africa, which is where we can find the etymological vestige of the titular THEOPHIS, which can be found in the name of the African country of Ethiopia. The words THEOPHIS and Ethiopia come from the same root because coded within them is a common occult symbolic allegory, and thus are both a reference to the culture that lived on the land that is surrounded by the Ethiopian Ocean. So we start here with an image of a map, and we're going to be dealing with a lot of maps as we go through this. And this is a map from 1700, and you'll notice I've said it's got the Ethiopic Ocean depicted on it. And if you have a look here, you'll see this, what we typically today call the Atlantic Ocean was once known as the Ethiopic Ocean off the west coast of Africa. And you'll also notice the word Ethiopia turning up in the land names in different parts of Africa, not just typically where Ethiopia would be today, which is around here. You'll see that the whole of Africa was typically known as Ethiopia, and the ocean that surrounded it was the Ethiopic Ocean. And this is noted in several maps, as we shall discuss when we go through this. So let's get into what the dragonology etymology relevance is for this particular episode. Of course, dealing with the word THEOPHIS and why it is relevant to Ethiopia, the root word ophi, which of course is the ancient Greek word meaning serpent or snake, and the, which is of ancient Greek origin and is a reference to the god or a cultural deity. So this word the comes up in a lot of interesting places like theology, which is a word that references the science of religion and the study of God. Theism, a word meaning belief in God or deities, as an example. So that's where the word THEOPHIS comes from. Now let's deconstruct this a little bit. The word Ethiopia contains the two before mentioned root words of the and ophi. And I'll explain to you how this works. As is often the case with dragonology-related etymology, the 6 vowel sounds of the alphabet being A, E, I, O, U, and Y are interchangeable, as is the case with the E on the, from THEOPHIS, which sees the E being replaced by an I vowel sound in the word Ethiopia. The serpent root word ophi contains the PH, or it's a phonetic consonants, which originate with the Greek etymon phi, which is represented in the Greek uppercase of a circle with a line through it, and the lowercase as this particular representation here. And you can see how very similar this is to the modern day P. You know, you can see the P in there, okay? So the phi is what the P became. These Greek symbols representing phi share a similarity in appearance with the letter P without the H. And thus, the letter P minus the H can be seen as a modern day derivative of phi. And thus, the dragon root word ophi is etymologically cognizant with the root word opi found in Ethiopia. So you can see where THEOPHIS has been taken out of Ethiopia, or Ethiopia kind of links into the word THEOPHIS. And one of the reasons why we named this particular series THEOPHIS is because it ties into absolutely everything that we're saying. Everything links into the next thing. According to maps from as recent as the 18th century, all of Africa south of Libya and Egypt was called Ethiopia, extending all the way to the west coast of Africa to include what is known today as Mauritania, Nigeria, as well as to the south to include the territories that form modern-day South Africa. And the oceans or sea surrounding it was known as the Ethiopian Sea or Ocean. This is the Martin Waldseemüller map of the northern half of Africa, published in Strasbourg in 1513. And again, you will notice that this particular area has been labeled with Ethiopia. You'll see it ringed in red as we go through them. Here's another map from 1555. Again, you see Ethiopia over there, and this, of course, referencing the west coast of Africa. And here's another map from 1635, and you'll see the Oceanus Ethiopicus, which is written in this lovely curly swirly letters over here, is actually spelt like this. And over here it mentions Ethiopia inferior vel exterior, right? So it's referencing the interior and exterior of Ethiopia. Here's another Ethiopian ocean map from 1710, again ringed in red, the Ethiopian Ocean. A map from 1789 depicting the Ethiopian Sea. And a map from 1787, which of course depicts the Ethiopian Ocean, Ocean Meridian or Ethiopian, meaning this whole ocean was known as the Ethiopian Ocean. It's interesting to notice you do have a reference to the Atlantic Ocean up here and the Indian Ocean up here, but largely this was known as the Ethiopian Ocean, the area down south that surrounds what is modern-day South Africa. A 16th century map engraved in the Flemish style by Arnold Florent van Langren also shows the word Ethiopicus, which you can see ringed on here. And this is the Ethiopicus, Oceanus Ethiopicus, which of course references off the west coast and the south coast here of Africa. And now we go to the Greek map, the world according to Herodotus from 430 BC, 430 years before Christ. And it's interesting because this is what we refer to as the ecumene, the inhabitable world, as the Greeks refer to it. It was the ecumene or inhabitable world, the world that they knew. You'll notice over here there's labels like unexplored. So the map that they created is really the parts of the world that they knew. Of course, Greece is in and around here because this is Europe and whatnot. Yes, you always recognize Italy because it's in the shape of the boot. And this would be Africa. Okay, now you'll notice the word Ethiopians over here and Eastern Ethiopians over here. That's very important because this does get mentioned in Greek texts, and I will get into that in just a moment. But it's interesting to notice that Ethiopians is actually thought to be anything sort of below the Sahara. And then there's still an Eastern Ethiopian. So it's the same culture that are divided into two parts. The Ethiopians and Eastern Ethiopians. The Greek historian Herodotus used the appellation Ethiopians to denote the parts of Africa below the Sahara that were then known within the ecumene, which is a reference to the inhabitable world. In the maps compiled by Herodotus, the region we know today as India was known as Eastern Ethiopians. Although there is no consistency from one ancient map to the next as to the exact territory referenced under the titular narrative of Ethiopia, what becomes clear is that the name Ethiopia applied to a far larger territory than just the country of Ethiopia that we know in our present times. The Ethiopian culture was indeed, as the etymology suggests, a theophic culture, which engaged in the worship of serpent gods or serpent deities. And here's some quotes about Ethiopia, all from ancient Greek sources. So from Homer's Odyssey, it says, "But now Poseidon had gone to visit the Ethiopians worlds away. Ethiopians off at the farthest limits of mankind, a people split in two, one part where the sun god sets and part where the sun god rises." Now, I just want to go back so you can see this is to the east and to the west, talking about where the sun rises and where the sun sets. So you've got Eastern Ethiopians and the Western Ethiopians. So the above quote references the Ethiopians to the west and to the east as seen in the Herodotus map. The next quote, "But now Poseidon, god of the earthquakes, saw him just returning home from his Ethiopian friends. From miles away on the Somli mountain range, he spied Odysseus sailing down the sea, and it made his fury boil even more. He shook his head and rumbled to himself, 'Outrageous! Look how the gods have changed their minds about Odysseus while I was off with my Ethiopians.'" And another quote, this one's from Homer's Iliad. "Only yesterday Zeus went off to the ocean river to feast with the Ethiopians, loyal, lordly men, and all of the gods went with him." I find this one particularly interesting because what it makes you realize is that the Ethiopians were a very special people, that the gods would all go and spend time with them or feast with them. And of course, as we get into this, you'll begin to see that all of this is very interesting, because although it may be allegory or story or just what some people might dismiss as fictional accounts or allegorical accounts by Greek authors, what you do find is a lot of what they're talking about actually is true. So here is Ethiopia in the present day, all right? Ethiopia is here in red, and it's a completely landlocked country, and it forms a part of the Horn of Africa and the northeastern part of the African continent. But this was not always the case. So the borders of Ethiopia have changed over the years. The parts of Ethiopia that have been referenced as Ethiopia, as also the borders have changed. But generally, it was accepted that anything south, according to the Greeks, anything south of the Sahara was referenced as Ethiopia. In the 4th century, Ethiopia, or what was then known as Axum, which is round about here, okay, the Aksumite Empire was one of the 4 great empires that existed around the 4th century. And of course, the others were Rome, Persia, and China. But Axum was the major empire. It was huge, and it extended its influence right across Africa. All 4 empires, of course, were theophic cultures. In fact, all 4 of these cultures worshipped serpentine or dragon deities. Not a coincidence, I can assure you. The kingdom of Axum has spent over 1,000 years as a worldwide power. It was a wealthy empire in a key position for international trade, and it had access, obviously, to the east and to Africa and the interior of Africa. So yeah, absolutely a perfect position for trade. From here, it could go off to India. From here, it could access what was Persia, and of course, it could go up into Greece and Europe and wherever else it needed to go. But it was a very, very powerful empire, and even had its own coins, as you can see over here. And this is the Ge'ez language printed on these coins. A major empire of the ancient world, the kingdom of Axum arose in Ethiopia during the 1st century of the current era. This wealthy African civilization thrived for centuries, controlling a large territorial state and with access to vast trade routes linking the Roman Empire to the Middle East and India. Most importantly, the city was strategically positioned at the crossroads of the trade routes running in every direction, from East African coast to the continent's interior. The Axumites took full advantage of these commercial opportunities. Gold and ivory were perhaps the most valuable export commodities, but they also trafficked in tortoiseshell, rhinoceros horn, frankincense, myrrh, emeralds, salt, live animals, and enslaved people. In exchange, they imported textiles, iron, steel, weapons, glassware, jewelry, spices, olive oil, and wine. Their trading partners included most of the major states in the known world, such as Egypt, South Arabia, the Middle East, India, and China. Perhaps the most important commercial partner were the Byzantine Romans. Axum was the first African country to mint its own coins in gold, silver, and bronze, all in the standard weight categories issued by the Roman Empire. The coins have been recovered in multiple foreign locations, including as far away as India. Shows you how far their trade routes went. Now, this is in Ethiopia. This looks like a medieval castle you'd find somewhere in the middle of Europe, but it's actually in Africa. It's very unusual to find this kind of architecture in Africa from so far back. Let's talk about the religions in Ethiopia. Ethiopia was one of the first regions in the world to adopt Christianity, and it remains the largest religion of the country, with 63% being Christian. Christianity in Ethiopia can be dated back to the kingdom of Axum, when King Ezana first adopted the faith in the 4th century AD. Again, this is when Ethiopia was at its height. And in order to be able to trade with Rome, it also had to be on the same page as Rome. And by that stage, Rome had already had the Council of Nicaea in 1333 AD, and Emperor Constantine had then Christianized the pagan faith. And of course, this is why religion spread so fast thereafter, especially during the 4th century, after this Council of Nicaea happened. And which is why I suppose Axum was so powerful, because it was able to trade with another Christian empire, or it was Christianized because it wanted to trade with another Christian empire. It's not always easy to tell which way it went, but what you normally find is that Christianity spread with civilization. So this is the Ezana stone, found in a field by a farmer. The stone is written in ancient Greek, Sabaean, and Ge'ez, the holy language of Ethiopia, similar to a Rosetta Stone type of thing. It records trilingually the conversion of King Ezana to Christianity and his subjugation of other kingdoms. It sits in a simple stone hut surrounded by fields with a basic lock holding shut the tin door. Now, this is Africa. They don't put these things in museums. Now, if you had to go see the Rosetta Stone, which is in the British Museum, it's very well secured, not like this. But suppose in Africa we don't really have anything quite like the British Museum. Ethiopia is also known as the cradle of mankind, and it absolutely deserves this title, as some of the most famous and most iconic hominid skulls have been discovered within the borders of modern-day Ethiopia, which claims many firsts following from extensive excavations in the 1970s, such as the finds that are important are, of course, the first Homo sapien, called Homo 1, which dates back over 233,000 years before present time. Lucy, the oldest and arguably the most famous hominid skull ever found, is 3.2 million years old, and that was found in Hadar. And the first family, a collection of 17 bodies of both adults and youngsters, and this offered a look at the behavioral patterns of early hominids. So interesting that you find all of these discoveries here, because this really is the cradle of humankind. Very interesting. Not a coincidence, I can assure you. There's a reason for this. Now, here's something that's very interesting about Ethiopia, is that Ethiopia has some of the most impressive collection of obelisks or stelae, and one of the biggest obelisks in the world is actually here. It's this one which has fallen down here. And it's interesting to note that the word obelisk is etymologically cognizant with the word basilisk. The obelisk technically is a symbol of the serpent. Okay, that would be the serpent's head, and that would be its long body. And a basilisk is said to be the king of serpents, capable of killing people with a single glance. Here is the shattered remains of the world's largest obelisk. Okay, and you can see how big it is compared to these people. It really is massive. And they've, I just think to myself, we don't even have the capacity to create these multi-megaton structures today and move them about. I mean, it's just unbelievable that ancient cultures were that advanced that they could make such incredible structures. From 1936 to 1941, Ethiopia was colonized by Italy, during which time the AKSUM obelisk was removed from Axum and taken to Italy. The Axum obelisk is 1,700 years old, weighs 160 tons, and is 24 meters high. The Axum obelisk has to be cut in 3 pieces in order to transport it to Italy. It was returned to Ethiopia in 2008 in 3 pieces, where it was reassembled. And this is important because in order to move this obelisk around, they had to cut this thing into 3 pieces just to move it. So what's interesting is when you look at these big obelisks, which were one single piece of stone. In fact, all these obelisks are single pieces of stone, which were quarried somewhere else and then transported to this location in the Obelisk Park, or the Stele Park, where they have stood ever since. Some of them almost 2,000 years old. You got to think to yourself, well, how did they do this? How were they able to transport them in one piece from where they were quarried and erect them? And this was supposedly done by primitive cultures who did not have advanced machinery or equipment. Interesting. Of course, we can see in modern day times, we can't even do that. We have to split the obelisk in 3 just to move it about. So this is a picture of the Axum obelisk in 1805. It's a drawing of it, prior to being moved to Rome by the occupying Italy. And this is after it was returned by Italy, okay, in the place that it's supposed to be. Another really fascinating thing about Ethiopia are the numerous rock-hewn churches that you find in Lalibela. Lalibela is the Amhara region. Lalibela is in the Amhara region of Ethiopia, which is famous for its 11 rock-cut monolithic churches. It has been a World Heritage Site since 1978. And in fact, it was the first recognized World Heritage Site. Carved from solid rock, the story goes that angels assisted in the construction of these churches. Now, this is a church that was built from the top down, so it had to be carved from the top down. It's, it's actually hewn out of a solid piece of rock. Okay, imagine the incredible precision and technology that would have to be able to make something like this, carve out of solid rock, and also built in reverse. Instead of building from the ground up, it's made from the top down. And that's interesting that they claim that because it's such a spectacular sight, most people go, well, wow, how was this done? They say that angels assisted in the construction of these churches because it's quite the feat. Now, it's interesting because the word angel is derived from the Latin word angui, or anguiem, the plural, which means serpent or dragon. That's where the word angel comes from. It's actually just a Latin word for serpent or dragon. Here's some more images of these rock-hewn churches in Lalibela. Interesting story that they actually put this covering over this church to stop it from being eroded by the rain. And then they found that they were damaging the church because it was too dry. It didn't have enough water in it and it was becoming brittle. So they are moving these coverings off now in an attempt to try and do what they initially wanted to do by putting them there in the first place, which is preserve these beautiful ancient structures which have been created. Look at this from the top. I mean, that's amazing. This has been carved from the top down in the shape of a cross. Truly incredible. This is an Amba, this little peaking hill here. An Amba is a characteristic landform in Ethiopia. It is a steep side, flat-topped mountain, often the site of sacred sites, churches, temples, villages, wells, and their surrounding farmland. Such settlements were frequently located on these Amba plateaus because they were very defensible and virtually inaccessible from the ground. So here you've got this like steep-sided, flat-top mountain range, and you'll see that they've got farmlands over here where they were farming, and obviously there's like a village or something on the top there. And there are loads of these sort of ambas all over. Here's the most famous one. It's known as DEBRE DAMO. DEBRE DAMO is the location of a 6th century monastery in the TIGRE region of Ethiopia, and it is located on the top of an amba. Right? Here it is. Look how inaccessible this looks. It sits at an elevation of 2,216 meters above sea level and is very difficult to access. The mountain monastery is only accessible by rope up a sheer cliff. It was once used as a prison for the Ethiopian emperor. It is known for its collection of ancient manuscripts and for being the earliest existing church building in Ethiopia. Tradition claims that it was founded by Abuna Aragawi. So here's the way up to the monastery. You can only access it by rope. Climb up here. Imagine how difficult that must have been to build. I mean, notice here as well, this is the church, typical of the ancient style. It's mortarless. This is a mortarless church. And interesting to notice how these crosses are depicted. They're like squares. Squares, always squares. Notice the mortarless stone and lintel construction. Ethiopia is an arid country, so water is not easy to come by, which means they don't really have water to mix with cement. And as a result, they use these stones just packed in very tightly to build mortarless construction. And it's not easy to do. It's far easier to build with some sort of cement or mud. But mortarless construction, to get it waterproofed and everything and get those stones fitted tightly together, it's real skill. And on DEBRE DAMO, here's the bell tower, which looks like it's been restored because it's been covered with a little bit of mud or clay. Earlier versions of cement. Notice here again, a mortarless wall, mortarless construction, not very common. Mortarless construction is a sign of extreme skill, particularly when it's quite as precise as this. And this is the interior of the church. I just love the way you can see how these wooden lintels are cracking and obviously holding up a very ancient roof. And here's some of the artworks and artifacts you can find in this church. But here is the most interesting one, which I've circled over here. You'll notice, if you can see, a little serpent curling and twirling around here in this particular artwork. So the paintings, this particular painting with the serpent is showing Saint Argawe ascending to DEBRE DAMO on the tail of a snake. Saint Argawe has a large halo, carries a tall cross, and wears a priest's robe and turban. To the left is Abun Matthias, also known as Matthew, who carries a prayer staff. Above is an angel, Saint Michael, who carries a sword and points towards DEBRE DAMO, which is on top of a flat mountain considered sacred to Ethiopia, directing Saint Argawe to the place where he is to found the famous DEBRE DAMO monastery. So here's Saint Argawe being lifted to the top of the Amba by a serpent. It's impossible to get up there without a rope. So who was the first person up there that created the rope for everybody to climb up? And they say that the very first person was lifted up there by a serpent. Interesting. Serpent in dragon symbolism is ubiquitous. It keeps coming up, always related to religions, always related to gods, always tying in with the angels and saints. It doesn't ever change, doesn't matter which country you're in. It's always, always interconnected. The serpent kings of Ethiopia. Arwe, also known as Wenaba, in Ethiopian mythology, is a serpent king who rules for 400 years before being destroyed by the founder of the Solomonic dynasty. His story comes in a number of versions, all of which have him as a tyrannical ruler who demands sacrifice. There's a few pictures that I could find. And again, a serpent, very clearly a serpent. Interesting to notice some horns over here. Dragons of Ethiopia. The veneration of Ara, being ophiolatry or serpent worship, was widespread and predates Christianity in Ethiopia. Ara, meaning wild beast in Ge'ez, is a snake king who rules for 400 years over the land that became Ethiopia. Ara is a giant serpent, and it says in quotation, no, Ara is not beyond the hill, for the hill you see is Ara, just to give an idea of his size. to whom humans must sacrifice their virgin daughters and cattle to calm his endless hunger. Ara or Wainaba reigns with terror until he is defeated by a man who became the next ruler of the land, and his daughter becomes the Queen of Sheba, also known as Makeda, who in turn becomes the mother of Menelik I, the supposed first emperor of Ethiopia. And here's a lovely image of Queen of Sheba from the Ethiopian fresco from around the 11th century. It's in Lalibela. One of the more amazing things about Ethiopia is that it is said to be the home of the Ark of the Covenant. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark is preserved in the ancient holy city of Axum. For centuries, the great relic was supposedly kept in the Church of Mary of Zion, where Emperor Iyazu is recorded to have seen it and spoken to it in 1691. The Ark was supposedly brought from Jerusalem to Ethiopia by the son of King Solomon and Queen Makeda, also known as the Queen of Sheba, as she was a Sabbatean, not Ethiopian. So she was known as the Queen of Sheba or Saba of the Sabbateans. Here's some artistic depictions of the Ark of the Covenant. So different people have different ideas of how it supposedly looked. It is believed by some Ethiopians that the dragon king, Arwa or Wainaba, ruled after Aksumwami, and it's Aksumwami who gave the name to Aksum. And Arwa or Wainaba is supposedly the great-grandson of Noah and son of THEOPHIS, according to the book of Axum. THEOPHIS, who was seventh in the ancestral lines, is also believed to be the 12th direct descendant of Adam. ETYMOLOGY is also believed to be a source of the titular Ethiopia. Now, this is where Ethiopia got its original name, was from this person who was supposedly descended from Noah and Adam. Very, very interesting. I'll just show you again here, the Ethiopian dragon, Ethiopicus. It says over here, Ethiopia Draco Ethiopicus, which is the Ethiopian dragon. This is a picture from a medieval bestiary. So the Ethiopian dragon had its very distinctive own type of dragon, more so than any other part of the world. You don't, for example, see like a Chinese dragon here, which is also a very typical style of dragon, but it's not depicted here. The Ethiopian dragon, however, is very much depicted. It was very well known. Just coming on from Arwa, who is a descendant of Noah and also a descendant of Adam, it's interesting to notice the serpent imagery, which turns out in the film Noah, which stars Russell Crowe. Here's two depictions of the serpent, one of the serpent in green, and here as it sheds its skin and has red eyes. It's, again, the duality being represented, and the shedding of the skin, which is evolution, change, birth, growth, the cycle of life. But if you watch the film Noah, you will notice that they have these, how do we say, flash images throughout the film of a serpent crawling through the grass. And there's another interesting serpent allegory in this film. In the film with Russell Crowe, Noah passes on the snake skin, symbolic of the dragon bloodline. He passes on the snake skin to his son. This is a snake skin that he's passing on to his son. So it is a passing on of the dragon bloodline. So again, all the serpent symbolism here ties in. Adam as well, who Ethiopicus is supposedly descended from, is inextricably linked with serpent symbolism. In practically all the stories of Adam and Eve, you come across this serpent in the Garden of Eden who spoke to Eve and gave her an apple, and Eve also got Adam to eat of the apple, and that was the fall of man. And the serpent is often depicted with a human countenance, sometimes in the face, often being said to be able to talk and walk, but absolutely in the shape of a serpent. So the serpent and Adam is inextricably linked as well. Saint George, famous for slaying the dragon. Saint George is the patron saint of Ethiopia, England, and Georgia, named after Saint George. And of course, Catalonia, which is where you found Barcelona, and Moscow, interestingly enough. Saint George is commonly depicted in artworks as slaying a dragon. And there are so many artworks, you can go Google them, or so many different people showing various different types of dragon and St. George depictions, but it's interesting to notice how all the dragons are slightly different. No one quite gets them the same. The vestige of the Ethiopian dragon is often found in bestiaries. A bestiary is a compendium of beasts originating in the ancient world. Bestiaries were made popular in the Middle Ages in illustrated volumes that described various animals and even rocks. The land of Ethiopia, the place where the gods bathe, celebrated by Homer under the name of Oceanus or Oceanus, is an excellent and desirable neighbor. This land, I say, is the mother of the very largest dracones, or dragon serpents. For you must know, they attain the length of 180 feet, and they are not called by the name of any species, but people say that they kill elephants, and these dracones rival the longest-lived animals. Thus far, the accounts from Ethiopia. And this is from a Greek natural history from the 2nd century AD by Elian. So just to come back to the roots of dragonology, and I want to just bring this all into context. In dragonology studies, whenever we reference the Anunnaki, the El or Elohim, the Ogigi, the creator, sun, fertility, agricultural deities, dragons, reptilians, angels, demons, hosts or ghosts, spirits, spies or spooks, jinn or genies, fairies or furies, vampire, gorgon, basilisks and griffins, flying serpents, mermaids and mermen, sirens, harpies, angry fish, hippocampus, chimera, most mythological creatures, Satan, Lucifer, and royalty. Whenever we are mentioning all of these, we are referencing the very same principle, being the dragon. Never forget that. They're just different names for exactly the same thing. Now let's go on to the Egyptian perspective. Right. Punt was called Tarneja in some Egyptian texts, meaning God's land. Now we've heard about the Greeks, how they refer to Ethiopia as the land where all the gods like to go and feast with the people there. So it was God's land. It's located in Northeast Africa. The geographical boundaries are unclear, but modern-day Ethiopian, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia is part of what was known as the mythical land of Punt. And Punt is roughly where AKSUM is in Ethiopia, and the territory is believed to include the Horn of Africa all the way to the coast. Of course, today Ethiopia is a landlocked country, but back then it was all the way to the coast because Punt was a major trading empire with Egypt. The Egyptians traded with Punt and got myrrh from Punt, which is essential to mummification. Other names for this region include Kush, with its people being referred to as Kushites. It is the ancient Greeks that gave us the etymon of Ethiopia. Prior to the Greeks coming along, it was known to the Egyptians as the land of Punt. So we've gone through all the different names, the Aksumite Empire, Ethiopia. Now we've come to the Egyptian naming, which is Punt. And Punt actually in the Dutch language means point, which is interesting because this is the point of Africa. It's literally a point, and it is the land of Punt. Was Punt the original theophic culture of Africa? It's interesting because according to the Egyptian pharaoh HAPSHETSUT, a female pharaoh from the 18th dynasty, she claims that the Egyptian culture came out of Punt. Punt was the original home of the ancient Egypts from which they first migrated north. Many older sources say the same, that the Egyptian culture came out of a much older, much more advanced culture, now lost, and that this culture originated in the land that was known as AKSUM or Ethiopia, known by the Egyptians as Punt. Mainstream academia postulates the idea that Egypt was the root of civilization in northern Africa, when in fact Egypt came from a much older civilization, which according to HAPSHETSUT was the land of Punt, also known as Ethiopia. HAPSHETSUT'S mortuary temple. This is Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, and it was largely destroyed by her half-brother or stepbrother who followed her as pharaoh, and he basically tried to deface any memory of her. So you'll notice a lot of the carvings of Hatshepsut's name have been defaced and removed from history. He tried to sort of erase that she ever existed. Hatshepsut was a wonderful pharaoh because during her time, there was almost no war, and there was massive building and construction that went on in Egypt, as you can see from this amazing temple structure here. So we're going to get into a little bit of the trade routes, because this is where it starts to get really interesting when you see just how big and important this particular part of the world has been in different parts in time. So here is the trade route of the 4th century Aksumite Empire. Now, bear in mind that they always traded with Egypt anyway. And there are other parts that they trade with, and this becomes interesting. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea from the 1st century AD says this: opposite Mountain Island, on the mainland 20 stadia from the shore, lies Agilis, from which there is a 3-day journey to Callao, an inland town, and the first market for ivory. From that place to the city of the people called Axumites, there is a 5-day journey more. To that place, all the ivory is brought from the country beyond the Nile. Right, so Africa is the place where ivory was sourced from. Okay, Africa is where all the ivory of the world basically came out of. So what they're talking about here is this is where the ivory center of the world was. And you'll notice the trade routes where they all went. So this is Axum. The trade routes went off to Egypt, went off to Europe, went off to India here. But also, most importantly, it went into the African interior. You'll see all the trade routes. So you'll see here we've got all the various trade routes which are controlled from Axum. Axum controls the whole of the trade through all of Africa, as well as exporting to India, Persia, Egypt, Carthage, and things from Benin, ivories and tusks and everything were bought in from Benin, were bought in from Zimbabwe. In fact, Zimbabwe was a massive trading post. Where you've got these circles here is where all the major trading centers were, okay? So there's a major trade center here, which is actually an outpost of Axum, as was the trade between Carthage and Axum. This is a major trading area here, obviously going up into the Iberian Peninsula. And we'll get on to the Great Zimbabwe, because that's very interesting. Remember what I said. This was an outpost of the Aksumite Empire. This is the Great Zimbabwe complex ruins. It's always been a bit of a mystery as to who built this and when. And you can see this is the major enclosure here. And in here, there's a conical tower, which is pretty much hidden by the trees here. But you'll see the ruins are all over this valley here. They go all the way there. And then they go up into the hills as well. There's more up in the hills. But it must have been an incredibly advanced and complex society who built this, because this is a very thick wall, and you'll notice it's all made with this typical mortarless construction, right? Typical of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is very big with a mortarless construction because there's no water there. In waterless places where there's not enough water to mix with the mud, mortarless construction, that is a key thing, and it takes a lot of skill to build something like this that has lasted all this time. So this is the conical tower, which exists in this great temple enclosure with the thick walls. And you'll see here's up on the hill how they've kind of built in all mortarless stonework. It's incredible. This is clearly an advanced society that built this. To put this together, you definitely need builders, stroke slaves. You need people who are feeding the slaves or farming. You need infrastructure. You need a complex society with different levels of different people doing different things to underpin the entire structure in order to build a temple complex or a ruined complex of this size. And again, more pictures of the skilled mortarless stonework of the Great Zimbabwe ruins. You can see here. And look at that wall. Isn't it incredible? Even the detailing in here. Now, this detailing might have been where they put, shot things from. Could have been a defensive wall. That could have been where they would obviously take cover in projectiles, whatever, arrows. Early weapons were perhaps used. But this is definitely a defensive wall. They didn't build a wall this high and this thick just for funsies. This is to protect something, valuable something. That is because this Great Zimbabwe ruin is actually got a much bigger function than what was initially thought. Before I get into that, I just want to take another look at this incredible stonework. Absolutely amazing, definitely made by very skilled people with a specific purpose. It's not just a dwelling. It's not just built by native Africans for the sake of being there. It had a very specific function. And you can even see the way there's like a double walls and a passageway which winds all the way around. This is clearly a structure that had a lot of planning and specific function of protection of something important. Great Zimbabwe started as a trading outpost of Punt or Axum or Ethiopia. Okay, it has been referenced in historical texts as Ophir. King Solomon received a cargo from Ophir every 3 years, which consisted of gold, silver, sandalwood, pearls, ivory, apes, and peacocks. This is from 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 22. So it's actually written in the Bible that King Solomon received cargoes from Ophir. The famous gold of Ophir is referenced in several books in the Hebrew Bible. The New Testament Apocrypha book, Cave of Treasures, contains a passage which says, "And the children of Ophir, that is, Sen appointed to be their king Lapharon, who built Ophir with stones of gold. Now all the stones that are in Ophir are of gold." Remember, there was huge amounts of mining going on in South Africa, and it has been going on since you can trace, as far back as you can trace humanity, you can trace their obsession with gold. Mining's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years in Africa. There's all sorts of evidence in old tunnels and stuff to prove that this has, in fact, happened much further back than mainstream historians and archaeologists are actually willing to admit. What's interesting to notice is that the word Ophir contains the Latin root word ophi, which means serpent or dragon. Ophir is cognizant with the word offer. So the word offering and sacrifice are synonyms for each other, and gold is often given as an offering or sacrifice, and gold is often referenced as Ophir, and ophi, the root word of Ophir, means serpent. So this gold was very much what was on the agenda for the dragons, which is why they talk about things. If you've seen Lord of the Rings, they talk about dragon sickness and the obsession with gold and how dragons hoard gold. They're inextricably interconnected. That is the thing that the dragons wanted. They wanted sacrifices and offerings. The offerings of gold, sacrifices of animals, the first fruits, the firstborn. This theme keeps coming up again and again and again. So let's look at the etymological evidence. Ophir was a trading city, part of the Ethiopian Empire, which controls most of Africa at various points in history. It can be seen from various maps that a continent-wide Theophic culture existed and was known by the Greeks and Portuguese cartographers as Ethiopia. And of course, architecture is an interesting thing because all architecture has signatures. It has style. All architecture will tell you a little bit about that culture. And when you look at the architecture, there's always evidence. There's always an architectural signature. Each culture has a distinctive architectural signature. Now, here we've got a 2,500-year-old wall, a temple wall of Ethiopia. This is a temple wall from around about the time when they were worshipping dragons. This is the wall of the Great Zimbabwe ruin. It's identical to the mortarless construction techniques of the Axumite or Ethiopian kingdom. Absolutely identical. Mortarless stone buildings come with great skill and is a signature of the Axumite or Ethiopian kingdoms. I did show you this castle, Fasilides Castle in Gondor, Ethiopia. interesting Gondar, similar to the name Gondor from Lord of the Rings. No coincidences, I can assure you. But look at this incredible structure, and large parts of it was actually built with mortarless construction, and it's been filled in over times to preserve it with a little bit of cement here and there. But this was a castle that was initially built with mortarless construction in Ethiopia. And just to show you a little bit again about the real skill that has gone into the Great Zimbabwe ruins, this is clearly from a much more advanced culture. People claim, oh, this was built by the Shona people, and this was built for a specific purpose, for protection of a trading post from where ivory was taken, it was collected en masse from Southern Africa and then taken off to Ethiopia. Look how thick these walls are. That is a defensive wall. We can see, and you can see all mortarless stonework. Okay. Look, these wooden lintels across here petrified over time. It takes a very long time for wood to petrify. These structures are not just a few hundred years old, they are thousands of years old. Okay, and they have stood the test of time, even though they have no mortar. They're just stone which has been skillfully put together. To create stones of the right shape takes a lot of time and skill, and then to put them all into the right place. This is not just a family who decided to build an enclosure, or a tribe that decided to build an enclosure. It would have taken hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves to build something like this. But look at this. All right, these are very advanced or beautifully constructed ruins. These beautifully constructed temples or castles or enclosures, all beautifully architecturally skilled with building, this is a very skillfully built structure, as is this. And compare it with this. This is the traditional African hut. The proof, as always, is in the archaeological signature. Here is the tribal hunter-gatherer pastoralist hut of the Shona people. This is what they built. And this is the remains of the over 1,000 years worth of the Axumite kingdom trading empire. They built this. It would have taken a very long time to build. All right. But here it is. It's still standing. It clearly doesn't look like this. It wasn't built by the Shona people. It was built by a very powerful empire who had slaves to build it. The official story in history would have us believe that the native Shonas built the Great Zimbabwe ruins, okay? The people who lived like this built this. I just don't understand it. It doesn't compute, doesn't make sense. It doesn't land because it doesn't add up. So if you compare the two, you see, this is something you can build maybe in a day or two. A little mud hut with a thatched roof. This is something that would have taken few years at least, and lots of people. This can be done by a family or a tribe. This is hundreds, if not thousands, of skilled labor, of laborers or slaves. Official history would have us believe that the native Shona built the Great Zimbabwe ruins, but it's just not true. If you look at the Shona people, this is an old photo of the Shona people taken from 1911. Look at how they live. Okay, very simply in mud huts. Here's some Shona farms. You can see the mud huts there. There's their animals. These just do not look like the kind of people who put all of their time and effort into building this massive ruin. These are semi-nomadic or pastoralists who put up semi-permanent mud hut structures, which, are definitely a lot easier to put up than that massive temple complex that we saw in the Great Zimbabwe ruins. So my final proposal or analysis is this. In the 4th century, which is 1600 years ago, Axum was one of the 4 main theophic empires in the world, rivaling Rome, Persia, and China. The Axumite Empire lasted for approximately 1,000 years with different rulers, royalty, and emperors. Axum's strength came from its trade and well-established and controlled trading outposts in different parts of what is now known as the African continent. The Great Zimbabwe ruins would have required great skill, resources, and manpower to construct. In order to have been constructed, complex societal structures would have to exist in order for slaves to be fed and for food to be grown, etc. Such infrastructure would have been costly and thus must have served a function, most likely that of protection of traders and trade goods based on the height and thickness of the walls. These ruins are part of a vast trade network that was rooted in Ethiopia, more specifically AKSUM, and which extended across Africa. It was most likely built by slaves, owned by wealthy traders, or by royal appointment, rather than tribes of hunter-gatherer or subsistence farmers. This skillfully built edifice is very different to traditional Shona dwellings, as it was not built by rural Shona. It was part of a vast trade network headquartered in AKSUM. Contrary to what we are taught, these ruins are not the dwellings of tribal Shona or Mashona who have been native to this region. There are ruins of mud and stick huts in later habitation layers of the Great Enclosure, indicating it was later inhabited by native Shonas, but it was most certainly not built by them, as mainstream history and academia suggests. In conclusion to our journey through Ethiopia, the evidence indicates that the area once known as Punt, the Kingdom of Axum, which includes modern-day Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, was most likely the first place this iteration of Homo sapien was found based on archaeological evidence and anthropological research. This area is the cradle of civilization as we know today, and it was most likely the very first Theophic culture, which then spread throughout the world, starting around this part of East Africa. There are so many interesting allegorical stories about dragon origins and control, with knowledge and favor given in exchange for ritual and sacrifice. Sadly, modern-day Ethiopia, and indeed great parts of Africa, are so ravaged by colonialism, war, poverty, and indeed even natural disasters such as earthquakes and floods, that most trace evidence in the form of artifacts or construction from the earliest habitation of advanced Theophic cultures has long since been looted or destroyed, or has yet to be discovered. However, the etymological evidence is clear. Ethiopia was the name given to Africa and is called as such as it was a very special sacred place, being the likely place of the very first Theophic culture existing over 100,000 years before present. The peoples of Ethiopia were venerated by sophisticated cultures such as the Greeks, as can be seen from the surviving texts. And that brings to a conclusion our Ethiopia section of THEOPHIS. Thank you for your time and attention. I've been Mel Ve, and it's been a pleasure.